962 billion naira. That is how much purchasing power Nigerian households lost in a single year. Not stolen, not spent, not lost in a bad investment. Simply evaporated, silently, invisibly, while people worked, saved, and did everything they were told was responsible. If you have 100,000 naira sitting in a standard savings account right now, here is the mathematical reality of your situation. At Nigeria's current inflation rate, that 100,000 naira will have the purchasing power of roughly 72,000 naira by this time next year. You did not spend 28,000 naira. You did not lose it in the market. You did not give it to anyone. It simply ceased to exist as real value, consumed by a force most people do not understand, cannot see, and have never been taught to defend against. This is not a Nigerian problem specifically. It is not a Ghanaian problem or a Kenyan problem. It is an African problem, and it is happening to your money right now, today while you read this, while you sleep, while you work. Regardless of how disciplined or careful or intentional you have been with your finances, inflation is the most effective wealth destruction mechanism ever created. Not because it is dramatic or sudden, but precisely because it is gradual and invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not send a notification. It simply operates continuously in the background of every financial decision you make, reducing the real value of every naira, every cedi, every shilling you hold, until the number in your account stays the same while its meaning quietly disappears. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this mechanism works, exactly what it is currently doing to every asset you hold, and exactly what Dangote has consistently done across 4 decades of operating in high-inflation African economies to ensure that his capital grows in real terms rather than simply maintaining a nominal balance that buys less every year. Act 1. The invisible tax you never voted for. Most people, when they think about losing money, picture a specific event, a bad investment, a theft, a business that fails, a market that crashes. Something visible, something dramatic, something that can be pointed to as the moment when the loss occurred. Inflation does not work this way. Inflation works through accumulation, small percentages, applied continuously, compounding over time into losses that dwarf what any single dramatic financial event could produce. Let me show you exactly what I mean with a number most people have never calculated for their own specific situation. If your monthly expenses are 150,000 naira today, and inflation runs at 28% annually, which is conservative, relative to recent Nigerian inflation figures, your monthly expenses will be approximately 72,000 naira in 1 year, 246,000 naira in 2 years, 3 to 15,000 naira in 3 years. TCTC. Your expenses did not change. Your lifestyle did not become more extravagant. You simply need more money to maintain exactly the same life, because the money itself is worth less. Now ask yourself this question honestly. Is your income growing at 28% per year? Is your savings account growing at 28% per year? Is your investment portfolio growing at 28% per year? If the answer to any of these questions is no, and for the vast majority of working people across African markets, the answer is no, then inflation is currently transferring real wealth from you to somewhere else, silently and continuously, regardless of how disciplined your financial behavior is. This transfer has a name in economics. It is called the inflation tax, and unlike every other tax, it was never legislated, never debated, never voted on. It operates automatically, affecting everyone who holds currency or currency-denominated assets, in proportion to how much of those assets they hold. The disruptor. I need to stop here and challenge something you might be thinking. You might be thinking, this is a macroeconomic problem, a government problem, something outside my control that I simply have to accept and work around. That thought is exactly what inflation needs you to believe to keep working effectively against you. Because here is what the data from the last 4 decades of African economic history actually shows. People who understood inflation and responded to it with specific, deliberate asset allocation decisions preserved and grew their real wealth across the same periods, during which people who accepted it as uncontrollable lost significant portions of theirs. Dangote built a $20 billion empire across periods of hyperinflation, currency devaluation, and economic instability. That destroyed the financial positions of countless businesses and individuals operating in the same markets at the same time. He did not do this by being immune to inflation. He did this by understanding precisely how inflation works and making specific decisions in response to that understanding. Those decisions are available to you right now, regardless of how much capital you currently have. Chapter 2. What inflation actually does to each asset you hold. Let me walk through the specific assets most people across African markets currently hold and explain precisely what inflation is doing to each one right now. Cash in a standard savings account. This is the asset most damaged by inflation. And it is also the asset most people hold the largest proportion of their financial position in, precisely because it feels the safest. A standard savings account in most Nigerian commercial banks currently pays between 2 and 4% annual interest. With inflation running at approximately 28%, the real return on a standard savings account is approximately negative 24%. Every year, someone holding their savings in a standard bank account loses roughly a quarter of the real value of those savings, not in nominal terms, because the number in the account stays the same or grows slightly, but in purchasing power terms, because what that number can actually buy decreases by approximately a quarter. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a catastrophic drag on financial progress that affects every single person who holds the majority of their financial position in cash or standard savings accounts, which is the majority of people across most African markets. Treasury bills and fixed income instruments. These instruments represent the first line of defense against inflation for most people operating in African markets, specifically because their yields, while not consistently beating inflation in all periods, substantially outperform standard savings accounts and provide at least partial inflation protection. Nigerian Treasury bill yields in recent periods have ranged between 15 and 22%. At the high end of this range, Treasury bills have come close to matching current inflation rates. At the low end, they have still substantially outperformed standard savings accounts. The specific real return depends on the relationship between the instrument's yield and the prevailing inflation rate at the time of investment. The important nuance here is that Treasury bill yields fluctuate, and the periods when inflation is highest are frequently also periods when Treasury yields are elevated, creating a somewhat natural partial hedge, though not a perfect one. Equity positions in productive enterprises. This is the asset class that has historically provided the most reliable long-term inflation protection, not because equity markets are immune to inflation's effects in the short term. They are not, but because productive enterprises can, over time, adjust their pricing to reflect the inflationary environment, passing increased costs to customers and maintaining real revenue growth even as nominal prices rise. The specific mechanism through which equity provides inflation protection is the underlying productive capacity of the enterprise, its ability to generate real goods and services whose value is not purely denominated in a single currency. A cement plant that produces physical cement maintains its productive value regardless of what happens to the nominal currency in which that value is denominated. This is precisely why Dangote's investment in productive industrial capacity has provided such robust protection against the inflationary and currency instability that has characterized Nigerian and broader African economic conditions across multiple periods. Real estate. Physical property provides inflation protection through two specific mechanisms. The rental income it generates typically adjusts over time to reflect the inflationary environment, maintaining real purchasing power even as nominal rents rise, and the asset value itself tends to appreciate in nominal terms, at least partially in line with broader price increases. Since property is a physical asset whose value is not purely currency denominated, the specific limitation of real estate as inflation protection in African contexts is the illiquidity it introduces, or the difficulty of converting property back to cash quickly when circumstances require it, and the concentration risk involved in holding a large proportion of wealth in a single asset, foreign currency and dollar-denominated assets. For investors in markets with high inflation and currency instability, which describes multiple African markets. Across recent periods, holding assets denominated in more stable foreign currencies represents a specific form of inflation and devaluation protection. This is not a recommendation to move all assets into foreign currency, so there are regulatory, practical and strategic reasons why a diversified position across both local and foreign currency assets is generally more appropriate than full conversion. But the specific protection offered by dollar or other stable currency-denominated assets against local currency inflation and devaluation is real, documented, and worth understanding clearly. Here is a calculation I want you to do right now. Take the total amount you currently hold in standard savings accounts or cash. Multiply it by 0.24, which represents the approximate real loss rate in the current Nigerian inflationary environment. The number you get is roughly what you are losing in real purchasing power this year from those specific holdings. Not losing to a bad investment, not losing to a market crash, simply losing to inflation, operating normally on assets held in the wrong instruments. Write that number down. Now ask yourself, is that number acceptable? Is that a cost you are consciously choosing to absorb? Or is it a cost you were absorbing without knowing it existed? Act 3. Dangote's 4-principle inflation defense. Here is how Dangote has consistently positioned his capital against inflation across 4 decades of operating in high-inflation African economies. Not as a theoretical framework, as observed, documented behavior reflected in the actual allocation decisions his enterprise has made across multiple economic cycles. Principle 1. Productive assets over cash positions. The most fundamental and consistent principle in Dangote's approach to inflation protection is the preference for productive physical assets over cash or cash equivalent positions. Factories, equipment, land, infrastructure, assets that produce real goods and services rather than simply storing nominal currency value. This preference is the direct expression of a simple insight. Cash held in a high inflation environment loses real value continuously. Productive assets generate real output whose value is not purely currency denominated, providing a natural hedge against the currency's declining purchasing power. The specific application of this principle at your scale does not require building factories. It requires the same fundamental preference for assets that produce income or real value over assets that simply store nominal currency value. Treasury instruments generating real returns above inflation. Equity positions in productive enterprises. Real estate generating rental income. These are the scaled-down expressions of the same principle that Dangote applies at industrial scale. Principle 2. Revenue diversification across currencies and markets. Dangote's operations span multiple African countries and, through trade relationships, multiple currencies. This geographic and currency diversification is not merely a growth strategy. It is a specific inflation and currency risk management tool. When the naira depreciates significantly, revenue from operations, denominated in other currencies, provides a partial offset to the purchasing power loss on naira-denominated holdings. The diversification does not eliminate currency risk. It distributes it across multiple exposures, reducing the catastrophic impact of any single currency's inflation or depreciation on the total portfolio. At your scale, this principle translates to deliberate inclusion of some proportion of dollar-denominated or otherwise foreign currency-denominated assets in your overall portfolio, not as a complete currency switch, but as a specific hedge against the concentration risk of holding all assets in a single high-inflation currency. Principle 3. Debt as an inflation tool when used correctly. This is the most counterintuitive of Dangote's inflation defense principles, and it requires careful understanding before application. In a high-inflation environment, fixed-rate debt actually becomes less burdensome over time in real terms, well, because the nominal amount owed remains fixed, while the currency in which it is denominated loses purchasing power. A loan of 10 million naira taken at a fixed rate today will be repaid with naira that are worth less in real terms than the naira borrowed, if inflation continues at current rates. This means that productive debt taken specifically to fund income-generating assets whose returns exceed the borrowing cost provides not just investment leverage, but actual inflation protection. Since the real cost of the debt erodes over time while the productive asset's real value is maintained or grows, the specific caution here is identical to what was discussed in earlier content on debt. This principle only applies to productive debt funding income-generating assets. Consumer debt or non-productive debt provides no inflation protection benefit. It simply adds the burden of interest payments to an already inflationary environment. Principle 4. Continuous reallocation as conditions change. Dangote's asset allocation has not remained static across 4 decades of varying economic conditions. His positioning has shifted across sectors, across currencies, across asset classes, in response to changing inflation rates, changing yield environments, and changing opportunities created by those conditions. This continuous reallocation is not speculation or market timing in the conventional sense. It is the disciplined, ongoing response to changing circumstances and moving capital toward better inflation protection when conditions warrant it, and toward better growth opportunities when those appear. At your scale, this translates to the regular portfolio review discussed in earlier content, not constant monitoring that produces reactive decisions, but scheduled deliberate reassessment of whether your current allocation remains appropriate given current inflation rates, current yields available, and current opportunities in each asset category. The challenge. Before the final section, I want to address the most common objection to everything I have just described. I understand the theory, but I do not have enough capital to actually diversify across all these asset classes. I have one account and a modest balance, and inflation is destroying it, and I do not know how to start. This objection is legitimate, and it has a specific answer. You do not start by implementing all 4 principles simultaneously. You start by implementing the single most impactful change available at your current capital levels, in which for most people in most African markets is moving whatever is currently sitting in a standard savings account into a treasury instrument or high-yield fintech product that provides at least partial inflation protection. This single change, even at a modest capital level, immediately reduces the real loss rate on your existing savings from approximately negative 24% to something in the range of negative 6 to positive 2%, depending on current yields. That is not perfect inflation protection, but it is the difference between losing a quarter of your real wealth every year and losing a small fraction of it, and it is available to almost anyone who currently holds any savings at all. Start there, build from there. Add the additional principles as capital and knowledge grow. The close. What this means for your financial trajectory. I want to close with something specific about the long-term significance of whether you understand and respond to inflation or simply accept it as an uncontrollable background condition. 2 people, same income, same starting capital, same discipline in saving and investing. The only difference, one understands inflation and allocates specifically to protect against it. The other does not, and holds the majority of their savings in standard accounts. Over 10 years, in a high inflation environment like Nigeria's current one, the difference in real purchasing power between these 2 people will be enormous. Not because of any dramatic difference in investment sophistication, but simply because one person's capital has been consistently protected from a force that has been continuously eroding the other person's. Inflation is not going to stop while you figure out how to respond to it. It is operating right now on whatever you currently hold, at whatever the current rate happens to be. The response does not require sophisticated financial knowledge. It requires understanding what inflation is, what it does to each specific asset, and which specific alternatives provide better protection. So say exactly what this video has given you. The naira you have right now is worth more than the naira you will have next year if you do nothing. Act accordingly. If this video shifted how you see your money, subscribe. New videos every 2 days on the systems and mindset behind Africa's greatest business empire. See you in the next one.